Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and helping to envision the future of the R3 district. First, let's get some technical details out of the way. We have interpretation available in Chinese. I'll take a moment to let our interpreter direct people to those language channels. Ivy?
Thank you. 谢谢大家晚上好。那么今天晚上如果大家需要收听中文的话呢，有实时的中文翻译，请您单击屏幕底部的口译图标，选择中文，以该语言收听会议。那么演讲时请保持静音，我们将有机会进行问答，请通过问答功能写下您的问题。如果需要提问，请使用举手键的按钮。谢谢。Thank you.
Thank you very much. So please keep yourself muted during the presentation. We will have an opportunity for Q&A afterward. And please use the reaction raise hand tool if you want to ask a question. If you're calling in, please raise your hand at the end of the presentation using *9. And after the presentation, we'll have a group discussion to talk about some of the key issues brought up in the presentation. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce myself and the project team. I'm Eric Anderson. I'm Advanced Planning Manager with the city. We're also joined by our consultants, Opticos Design, including Stefan Pellegrini, Tony Perez, Beth Sichan, Russell Toller, Martin Galindez, and Roger Foreman. Lastly, we have support from other Community Development Department staff, including Anna Reynoso, Brittany Whitehill, Edgar Maravilla, and Diana Pancholi. You will have an opportunity to meet some of them later on this evening. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to get input on the R3 zoning update. This project is an action in the Council's strategic roadmap. It's part of a priority to help create housing options in the city. This meeting is focused on the Grant Sylvan Park neighborhood. Other workshops have focused on other neighborhoods. Tonight's workshop will include 3 parts: a presentation overview of where we've been with the project and some options for where we can go. Then we will go into breakout groups to hear from each other about your thoughts on each option. And lastly, there will be a report back. The R3 zoning update is only part of the city's interconnected housing programs. In addition, the city is preparing the housing element, which is a state requirement to plan for more housing and address housing equity. Council direction was to not rely on the R3 update to accommodate units required of the housing element. A draft of the housing element is under review by the state now, and we expect it to be adopted by the end of the year. We're also preparing a displacement response strategy, which could include affordable unit replacement and tenant relocation requirements, as well as preservation efforts. The displacement response strategy is under review and would apply to the R3 zone with or without this update. Lastly, we're preparing a middle income strategy, which will include an increasing portfolio of moderate income ownership and rental units and homeownership assistance. The R3 update would help support this strategy by creating more middle income units. R3 is one of the city's standard zoning districts, and it's intended for a broad range of residential development types. It covers much of the city and almost all of the neighborhoods with multifamily, row house, and HOA developments. The R3 zone regulates development through standards, which new buildings need to comply with. One of these standards is maximum density. This maximum density can vary across the R3 zone and can depend on the neighborhood. Other standards, such as the 3-story height limit and limits on floor area ratio, or FAR, setbacks, and minimum open area, don't vary across the R3 district. Recently, almost all development has led to expensive row homes, and a few recent examples are shown here. It's also important to note that state density bonus applies to R3 today, which could result in buildings more than 3 stories and other waivers of development standards, such as lot coverage or setbacks. So why update the zoning? As I stated earlier, the City Council has a goal to increase housing options in the city, and the R3 zoning update is a key part of that effort. The city is looking into a form-based approach. This means that the standards focus on the form of the building rather than its contents. For example, a building with more small units would be treated the same as a building with fewer large units. This has several benefits. The current framework of densities do not address neighborhood conditions. Through a zoning code update, we can locate higher densities near transit or services and modulate the character defining standards like FAR setbacks and open area to reflect changes in density. Changes to standards can also help create a broader range of unit types, including more stacked flats, which can be relatively more affordable than row homes and other product types. Lastly, with a form-based approach and by calibrating standards to each other, we can create more flexibility while simultaneously creating more predictability and streamlining the approval process. It should also be noted that there is a state law in effect that says we cannot reduce residential density or increase constraints on density. So some growth can occur, however, and your input can help inform how much. Before we get too much further, we should define some terms. House scale generally refers to separate buildings along a block, usually up to about 80 feet wide. They can include multiple units and generally up to about 2 to 3 stories. Block scale refers to buildings that are attached or very close to each other along the full length of the block. So with that out of the way, let's take a quick poll. The purpose of this poll is to get an understanding of the stakeholders of this meeting. This way we can see if we need to target any misgroups later on. So here's the poll. Please select if you rent or own your home in this neighborhood, if you own property in this neighborhood, or if you work or own a business in this neighborhood, or none of the above. Okay, we'll wait maybe another 10 seconds. All right. So here are the results. Exactly 50% of you are homeowners in this neighborhood. A few more renters, and a few none of the aboves, and some one property owner. Thanks again for responding to that poll. So let's get into what we've heard so far. This project started in 2020. We conducted workshops and prepared a development framework that was presented to the Environmental Planning Commission and City Council back in 2021. That framework looked at maximizing development potential. It looked at the characteristics of each site and analyzed how large a building the site could feasibly accommodate. In addition, there was analysis of how many existing units could be replaced at rents or sales prices affordable to those living there today. As a result, the framework presented last year had buildings from 3 to 6 stories. Upon review, the City Council directed staff to go back out and get more input from the community. Earlier this year, we talked to a few different stakeholder groups and heard a few key messages. For example, some wanted more housing and others were more cautious about growth. Many wanted to plan for growth using precise plans and a general plan update. We want to ensure that infrastructure, parks, and schools can support growth. Interest in creating better access to retail, services, and amenities. Focus new housing near transit. Consider mobility and streetscapes when you're designing new development. Protect privacy and greenery, especially trees. Some disagreement, some wanted lower parking requirements in order to facilitate less expensive housing, and others wanted to minimize neighborhood parking impacts and to ensure that new residents could park their cars and own a car to get where they needed to go. And of course, reflect all opinions that we hear and don't hide the downsides, and protect people from displacement and rent increases. So in response, we prepared an alternative that seeks to address what we've heard along these 5 major categories. This slide summarizes the growth framework I talked about from last year. It included these sub-districts ranging from 2 to 6 stories. The 2-story sub-district focused on areas with small parcels and no 3-story buildings in the vicinity. The 3- and 4-story sub-districts were in areas with a mix of different surrounding building sizes and parcel sizes. The 6-story sub-district was just for the sites with the most development capacity and fewest surrounding 2-story buildings. But as I said, we're taking another look at how sub-districts could be different. So rather than focusing on differences in height, we could focus on differences in scale and character. An alternative framework could have lower intensity districts be more house scale, and higher intensity districts could be more block scale. These are some alternative districts. As you can see, the images show how buildings can be more massive, including more width and fewer space between adjacent buildings at the higher sub-districts, without necessarily increasing height. Later in the presentation, we'll look at a map of where these districts could go. During your breakout rooms, you can respond to these pictures. For example, is there anything you like about these buildings or things you don't like? Are there locations where some of these buildings might be appropriate, or even some of the previous framework's buildings? We put a lot of thought into transitions of height and scale into existing neighborhoods. These pictures show how smaller building scales, including height, width, and depth, can help buildings fit better into the community, despite small setbacks and 3- or 4-story to 1- or 2-story transitions. In addition, we've revised the proposed R3 map and eliminated cases where higher intensity subzones would be added adjacent to lower density neighborhoods. The lower intensity subzones could have new standards that could limit scale in terms of height, width, and depth, both facing the street and along internal property lines. In addition, privacy and screening concerns can be addressed through landscaping. A form-based set of standards can also help support improved pedestrian connections and streetscapes by encouraging connections to the sidewalk and a comfortable walking environment. Publicly accessible open space can be provided through incentives. If developers are allowed to build the same amount of building through allowance of an extra floor, new public parks become a win-win where the community can benefit from the additional open space. The R3 zone could also be an opportunity for small neighborhood serving goods and services, increasing the vibrancy and walkability of the city's neighborhoods. Later on, we'll ask you about how you feel about these types of uses in your neighborhood and where they might be appropriate. As I said earlier, the 2020 growth framework essentially maximized development capacity. The new alternative map would focus development capacity increases in strategic locations, resulting in a smaller increase to overall development capacity in the R3 zone. In addition, R1 and R2 neighborhoods are only adjacent to R3A and B, and at the same time, we're targeting higher intensities to key destinations like transit and services. So as you can see, here is the Grant Sylvan neighborhood with El Camino Real cutting through the middle. Most of Grant Sylvan is R1, as you can see in the area between Grant and 85, small area of R1 also around Sylvan Park, and R2 around Sylvan Park as well. The previous framework had R3C districts around El Camino Real and around Highway 237. This replaces that framework with densities of R3B, which would be somewhat smaller than the previous R3C proposal. Other areas closer to R1 neighborhoods or farther away from transit, El Camino Real, and services would be R3A, smaller scale buildings. So we will be asking you in the breakout rooms to weigh in on these two maps. You can be thinking about whether we should change any of the locations of subzones, or are any of the previous subzones a good idea anywhere? Where are transitions important? Where would neighborhood serving commercial be appropriate? So that summarizes our alternative approach. Tonight, you'll have an opportunity to respond to these ideas. In your breakout groups, you can discuss these questions, like what do you like in the examples of the buildings? What don't you like? Where could they be appropriate? Where should pedestrian and bicycle users be prioritized? Where would you support allowing small neighborhood serving commercial uses? What do you like better about the 2022 map or the 2020 map? And what other ideas do you have? In closing, I'd like to make it clear that this is not an all or nothing approach. Form-based principles, neighborhood commercial, and open space can move forward with the 2020 map, or we could use parts of the 2020 map and parts of the 2022 map. Lastly, you may have other ideas that we haven't even thought of yet. But before we go to our breakout groups, let's do some Q&A. This section is for clarifying questions of materials presented. Please hold your comments to the breakout groups when we can make sure to note them down. So, Beth, can you help us lead the Q&A? If you have questions, please raise your hand in Zoom or press *9. Maybe everybody here has already been to several of the other meetings. Here we go.
Okay, we'll start with Lee.
Yes, hi, Eric. I've gone through all your meetings. I do like to get a review, just try to understand is all the units allocated to R3 workshops are in additional to the housing elements. That 11135 the city are planning to build in the next 8 years.
Yes. So, yeah, just to clarify that the housing element is a state requirement. And yes, we are required to show that we have zoned adequate capacity on developable sites for 11,135 units. And so to answer your question, yes, council has directed us to not include the R3 update in the housing element. So that means that any additional units that are capacity for any additional units created through the R3 update would be in addition to capacity in the housing element.
Okay, would you be able to provide us a very high level estimate on how many in total these R3 were created? How many units?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. A lot of it will depend on the direction that council ends up deciding to go in. There was an estimate of the 2020 framework, so the map that we saw, the map on the left before with the higher intensities and the taller buildings, that could create the potential for 9,000 additional units. The 2022 map would almost certainly be fewer additional units. And then there's also the existing capacity of the R3 zone, which is probably in the, in the several thousands, but certainly a lot less than 9,000.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to be asking all the questions, but it's concerning, right? Because what's the time frame you're planning for all these units being built with this R3 zoning?
Yeah, it would be completely up to the property owners. So once you adopt the zoning, then any property owner could come in and decide to build a project consistent with that zoning. And it's very hard to predict exactly when property owners might decide to do that. It would certainly, oftentimes our planning horizons are 20, 30 years. And oftentimes when you do a planning horizon that long, things are changing the whole time and the world never turns out exactly how you expect it to. But this would be zoning capacity that could be created and a property owner could come in and take advantage of it anytime.
Thank you for Lee.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
If you have another question, then we can go to Van and then we can come back to you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Van?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. What is the difference in R1 and R2 designations on your map?
Yeah, great question. So R1 is intended for single family homes, and R2 is intended for duplexes. Now that's kind of a little bit different now since the state adopted SB 9, which overrules cities' single family zoning and allows a certain amount of duplexes, or we call them duets here, or and other development in R1 as well. But that's the intent of R1 versus R2, that the R1 zone is intended for single family and R2 is intended for duplexes.
Thank you.
You bet.
Lee, it looks like no one else has a question at this point. Do you have any more questions?
Yeah, just I added up all the numbers Eric provided earlier. It will be 20,000 units in the next 8 years if developers were able to develop all these housing. That would be a huge increase of population density. What are the plans for the city to accommodate these almost 30-40% increase of population in such a short period of time, if this does happen in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so part of the planning process that we would go through as we further refine the R3 zone would be addressing those infrastructure issues and those parks issues and things like that that were that the community identifies as a concern. We're also working with our community services division to prepare a Parks and Recreation strategic plan, which it can be informed by growth projections. The housing element and the housing element environmental impact report do have some assessment of the effect of 11,135 units or even 15,000 units, which includes the buffer that we're encouraged to include over the next 8 years, including on water supply and infrastructure. So this is all analysis that we carry out. And at this point for the R3 zone, it's a little preliminary to start going down that path because we don't really know kind of where the community is indicating for us to go, where council wants us to go. But we're more than happy to take your concern about the effect of this growth as a comment. And please do provide it as a comment during the breakout groups.
Thank you, Lee. Does anyone else have a question?
I just have one quick question. Sorry, I couldn't find, I'm on my phone, couldn't find the raise hand. I remember city talking about sustainability and just be more green and stuff. How will this population growth affect our effort to be more sustainable and be more conservative with our water usage and overall pollution control?
Sure, that's a great question. There's a lot of potential opportunity through new development to make sites greener. So new development tends to be much more energy efficient, much more water efficient than what's on the ground today. There is also an opportunity with additional housing to reduce the city's overall, to reduce the city's per capita vehicle miles traveled, which has an improvement on the overall efficiency of the city's transportation infrastructure and our effectiveness in fighting against climate change. And there are probably several other reasons that you could probably hear from other people in groups today about why it is maybe sustainable to adopt more growth through the R3 update. So I think that's a great question. And if you have concerns about how it may be more sustainable to scale back growth, we'll take those comments as well. So we're certainly interested in hearing this conversation about sustainability and what is the most sustainable path for the city.
And thank you. We are out of time for questions.
All right. Thank you, Beth. So now we're going to go into our breakout groups. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. I think we're just waiting for a couple of groups to finish up here, and pretty soon everybody is going to be back. Heard a lot of great conversation. Thanks to the facilitators and the note takers and everybody. A lot of people just pitching in, even the attendees pitching in, helping to clear up questions and provide backgrounds on the city and standards and everything. It's a team effort. Thank you all so much. Yeah, I hope you had an excellent time with your group, and I hope you provided a lot of great input to this process. Again, thanks again for coming out tonight. Next, let's talk to somebody from each group and get a summary of the big ideas and discussion points that came up. So, group one.
Yeah, group one is going to be summarized by Alex.
All right. We had a fun group tonight. It was good. All right, so let's start with the first sub-district on scale and character. Most of the people in our group liked 2020's 6-story thing and are sad that that's not the current state. A lot of people wanted the block scale because of the additional density, just being able to use it for more housing. There was some concern about the congestion caused by additional housing in the area. When it comes to transitions for the height scale, there was some concern about light and how much sun buildings will get, and everyone agreed that there should be like some setbacks or spacing between buildings to allow for that. But there's also a lot of we should have more density. That it is that the people who want broad spaces around their homes probably won't get it because this is not Montana, and that there is going to be change, and the change is a constant, and that we need to increase density, and some of that is going to be a cost to the people who have homes from the 50s. For pedestrian connection streetscapes, everyone liked really wide sidewalks, and especially landscaping between the sidewalks and the buildings. There were mixed views about stoops and other kind of elevated frontages. But yeah, wide sidewalks, pedestrian access, especially stuff that accommodates people who are older or disabled. For the POPAs and other concessions for green spaces, it was a consensus that we like green spaces and open space and nature. There was a subset of the group that wanted it no matter what, so no concessions, just all projects should have publicly accessible open natural space. But a lot of people, the rest of the group, said they're fine with having additional housing, and that is a benefit in and of itself to have additional height and density with the housing if you're also going to get green space. Win-win. Everyone also agreed that commercial space, ground floor retail was good for different reasons, but some of us wanted it to be mandatory for all, basically all properties should have a ground floor retail. There was a discussion about how it, we used to have things like tailors, cobblers, other things in town, but now it's just restaurants, which is kind of monoculture because they've been driven out by high rent prices, and that adding more small pads that are rentable by various businesses would let Mountain View continue to have a diverse ecosystem of business areas. And I think that's it, other than what's up with the Nob Hill area, but I think that's in the other neighborhood.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. Really, really good report back and really great conversation. I really appreciate how your pig just agreed with everything you said. So group 2.
Yeah, so we had a good time in group 2. I didn't get any volunteers to summarize unless they want to speak up now real quick. Okay, no, it's cool. I'll be sharing. I'll work backwards. Right at the end, we started talking about the importance of architectural design and aesthetics and how the standards might be written to ensure that buildings look good when they come in. A lot of people said yes to just about everything we looked at. So anything that the city could do to allow more units to get built, more neighbors to come in is a good thing. We talked about the importance of connectivity through large sites. So providing pedestrian connectivity or bicycle connectivity, also using the update as an opportunity to ensure connectivity from those sites to the existing bike and pedestrian trails. The Stevens Creek Trail came up a lot. ADA concerns. So when we showed those stoops and porches, there were some thoughts about access, wheelchair access, things like that. I want to get into some of these interesting comments. We talked about the views of the mountains. And so when we talked about building height, there was an example given of a new gas station that blocked the mountain view, which is an ironic thing an appropriate thing to be thinking about. But what sort of zoning standards and regulations could mitigate against the blockage of those mountain views? Consensus on ground floor non-residential uses. So whether they're new projects, new big projects in exchange for additional height or density or not, having ground floor commercial uses. Somebody expressed their concerns about those uses being normally higher price than other places. Other people had interesting comments about the development standards allowing existing places in R3 have a little more flexibility with their ground floor. So perhaps allowing them to open their garage, opening some sort of non-residential retail or service use right out of the garage. Parking, of course, came up, and we had a lot of people talked about how it's a tricky issue. There were ideas about it being consolidated somehow into a structure or two so that there could be a little more potential and flexibility with those existing sites, so that they won't have to plan so much around parking. Yeah, just the removal of red tape for these sites to develop and develop affordably and feasibly. So I think I got everything, but if I missed anything, speak up, group 2. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Russell, and great job facilitating that group. Group 3.
Great. So I will be sharing thoughts from my group, and then I would invite anyone from my group to chip in at the end if I miss something, because I'll give more generalities. Okay, so first, a big emphasis on looking at the context and surroundings before applying a zone. We really support promoting community feelings and have concerns specifically about traffic tied to the density that might be added here. Specifically talking about the Grant and El Camino junction as well as Grant Road. A new idea for some transfer of development rights, which would allow higher buildings certain places and then more open space potentially. Recommend that buildings near El Camino are taller. For the frontages, really recommend deep-rooted trees so they don't tear up the sidewalks, and promoting subterranean parking and making it realistic within the code. We agree that mixed use is convenient and we'd recommend more density near mixed use, but it might actually not be needed in this neighborhood because El Camino is pretty stacked. And there was a conversation about more low-income housing being added to this project, and the associated potential for crime, but also the potential for stronger community. So to reiterate, just really see this as a chance to create that neighborhood feeling. And we especially saw R3A as a way to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. Again, great facilitating. Appreciate everybody's comments. I think that was the last group, right?
Yes.
Right. So before you leave, we have a couple more announcements for everyone. Share my screen again. First of all, if you feel like you had more to say, or if you have a neighbor that couldn't make it, please log on to our website here, this mountainview.gov/R3 zoning update. The URL is also on the flyer and the notice that you might have. You'll have an opportunity to provide comments on all these topics through a link of this website. After this outreach, which will carry on through the end of 2022, we will develop options and return to the EPC and Council for their review in early 2023. And we're expecting to take adoption to the Council in late 2023 or early 2024. So thanks again. This concludes this workshop. This includes all the workshops, in fact. Appreciate everybody's participation and great input. And to the Opticos team and the city staff team, thanks again so much for all your great help across 6 very exciting evenings. So really appreciate it, everybody. I'll hang out for another few minutes if anybody has any questions. But again, you know, Mountain View has some of the most engaged folks, and just engaged in just such a really wonderful, civil, delightful way that provides great input to staff and council, and we couldn't do what we do without you. So thank you all so much for coming.